In behalf of the Living History program at Duke University, it's my honor to chair this interview with the Honorable Samuel W. Lewis, President of the U.S. Institute of Peace, and formerly U.S. Ambassador to Israel, among a number of distinguished assignments. Ambassador Lewis is at Duke as a Rudnick lecturer. Participating with me in this interview is Tim Lamperis, Professor of Political Science, and Alex Rowland, Professor of History and Chairman of the Department. I'm Bruce Cunningham, Professor of Public Policy Studies and History and Director of the Terry Sanford Institute of Public Policy. Ambassador Lewis, among your distinguished assignments, your ambassadorship in Israel undoubtedly was one of the more important ones that you ever had. And as a way of getting into that ambassadorship, I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the circumstances surrounding your appointment as ambassador to Israel, what perhaps relationship you might have had with President Carter and some of his staff.
It really started with the election of 1976. I was at that time in the Ford administration Assistant Secretary for International Organization Affairs, United Nations Affairs. I'd been in that post only about 15 months, and I was doing, I thought, quite well and enjoyed it and found it fascinating. It was a difficult time in our relations with the UN, but I liked what I was doing and really wanted to stay. As a career officer, I thought that might be a possibility. And when the transition occurred, Secretary-designate Vance came into the department with a transition team, as is the custom between administrations, a bunch of young experts, one of whom was assigned to, say, 2 or 3 bureaus in the State Department to look it over and recommend to Vance what to do about it, what changes to make, what people to keep. Bill Maines, now the editor of Foreign Policy magazine, was the transition team member who was assigned to look over our bureau. Bill had been a Foreign Service officer earlier in his career, but he had left the State Department sometime earlier. I found out later that he had his eyes set on that job, though he didn't tell me that when he came around to interview me politely and talk about the work of the Bureau. He went over our Bureau rather carefully, and in his report to Cy Vance, he said he thought I was doing a very good job and that I ought to stay, which says something about Bill, given his own ambitions. So I was quite encouraged. At the same time, Andy Young had just been named by Carter to be his new ambassador to the UN. And Andy had a rather stereotypical view, let's say, of the State Department. He didn't think much of it. And he let it be known immediately that he didn't want anybody in New York or in the Bureau in Washington that worked with the mission in New York who had ever worked for President Ford or President Nixon, whether they were career or non-career. He just wanted all of them out. There was a considerable argument went on about this. He did clean out New York, though most of the people there were career diplomats. And Vance was torn, I was told, but Andy was much closer to Jimmy Carter than Cy Vance was. And Vance had a lot of other problems, and he didn't feel that this was important enough to go to the mat with Andy over. So Cy decided he had to move me out. But apparently he felt a little guilty about it. And Phil Habib, who was Undersecretary for Political Affairs and the senior career officer in the State Department, thought well of my work, and he had urged keeping me on. When it turned out that wasn't politically wise, he then suggested to Cy that they ought to get me a good mission. And ultimately I was sounded out about 3 missions. India, South Africa, and Israel. I'd never really thought at all about Israel as a post. I'd only been there once, 3 days on a visit when I was in Afghanistan, visiting Nick Veliotis, who was then number 2 in the embassy. But I had been very much involved for the last year and a half on Arab-Israeli diplomatic issues in the UN. That took up about half of my time. It was the period when the Palestinian Liberation Organization was just making its run to get fully recognized in the UN system, and we were fighting it off. And so I was involved a lot with Israeli diplomatic issues, but I really didn't know anything at all much about the country. Still, the minute it was mentioned as a possibility, I was truly intrigued. So I said, well, I'd be delighted to go to India, but I'd prefer to go to Israel. I really don't want to go to South Africa. I grew up in the South, in the segregated area, in Houston. I'm not sure I can handle emotionally some of the challenges of South Africa. I'd really rather not go there. So Israel it was, after a certain amount of soundings. There's one other dimension of this that might be interesting, though, and that's how ambassadors to Israel are chosen. And it's a long tradition now, which I was only one example. After my name was sent over to the White House by the State Department as a nominee, there were also some political candidates. There always are, of course. State Department makes nominations for ambassadorial posts from among the career service. White House has some other ideas, and ultimately there's a kind of a thrashing out, and sometimes state gets its candidate, and sometimes the White House gets a political candidate. There have always been political candidates for the job in Israel, usually Jewish Americans who want to serve there. We've never had a Jewish ambassador in Israel. And we had not had we had mostly career people back in the 50s. Wally Barber, a career officer, had served for 11 years, all during the 60s and into the 70s. Ken Keating from the political world had served only a couple of years and then died in office. And then Mac Toon, my immediate predecessor, was a career officer. So it had been largely career, with the exception of Keating. But whenever the job comes open, the White House had been in the practice, and I think probably still is, of quietly asking a friendly congressional intermediary to find out whether the Israeli government would prefer to have a political appointee or a career officer. Very, very interesting. And invariably, the Israelis have always replied, well, of course, it's none of our business, but if you ask us, we think it might be better to have a professional. And that was, again, what happened. Senator Ribicoff was the intermediary in this case. And it always comes out that way for, I think, a very rational reason from the Israeli point of view. They figure, obviously, they have lots of political lines to an American administration, but their problems have frequently been with the career service. So they figure if they can convince a career officer that some of their views are sensible, they will add to their persuasiveness with an administration. So that's how it got there.
Now, when you were appointed, what was the actual month of your appointment?
I was named in February. I was actually sworn in May after confirmation and clearances and so on, May of '77. And I arrived there the day after the election that brought Menachem Begin to office. I could have gotten there a week earlier, but the election was about to take place. By that time, I'd learned enough about Israel from talking with everybody I could find that to understand it, I was going to be walking on a lot of political eggs. And I didn't really want to get off the airplane a week before the election, be mobbed by the Israeli press, make a statement and inadvertently say something in the course of that that could be seen as an intervention in the election. So I went to Taormina and rested for a week and read and tried to pull up my socks a little bit before arriving. And I got off the plane then the afternoon after the election. And I found out about the election returns. Everybody assumed that Shimon Peres would be elected. Everybody in the State Department assumed Labor would again, when the Labor had never been out of office in the history of the country. I had a briefing session that INR had organized for an all-day session with a bunch of scholars and specialists on Israel before I went out. Some Israeli, some American. Every one of them predicted Labor victory except one. And he was very close to the Likud people and turned out to be quite accurate in his predictions. That was Amos Perlmutter from American University. And I've always regarded, Amos is viewed as kind of a wild man by his colleagues, but because he called this election right, I've always taken him very seriously. Anyway, I didn't have any preparation really for dealing with Begin. All of my preparation had been for dealing with Peres. I'd talked to everybody I could find who knew Peres, who dealt with him. Wally Barber up in Massachusetts in retirement, who was a close friend and worked with him for years, and lots of other people. And nobody in the State Department gave Begin a chance. So it was quite a shock. When I arrived in Rome to change planes to go on to Israel that morning, I was met by an old friend, Ned Bain, who was for many years covered Israel for the American University's field staff. And Ned gave me the election returns. And we talked for about 15 minutes about their significance. And so I changed one line in my prepared arrival statement to adjust to the new situation.
One of the things we've discovered in our interviews is that when it gets to the documentary record, particularly when that documentary record is available, that we can sometimes know more than the people we're interviewing about the details.
I'm not surprised.
One thing that we don't get from those documents generally is a sense of the personalities involved in their relationship. And I'm wondering if we could explore with you some of these personalities and your relationship with them, maybe perhaps starting with Menachem Begin and how you got to know him, how you did research on him, your relationship with him, but also his relationship with some of the other principals in the Arab-Israeli negotiations.
Well, let's start with how I got to know him. I owe a tremendous debt of gratitude to Stanley Moss, who was then the public affairs officer in the embassy, head of USIS. Stan was the only person in the embassy who really knew Begin. Begin was the opposition leader. Mac Toon had seen him occasionally and rather liked him, I gather. But he wasn't a regular contact for the embassy because he wasn't much of a player in a government which had been in the hands of Labor for all of its life. And he was viewed as a kind of a strange extremist duck. But Stan liked him, and Stan had seen him occasionally, and they had gotten on well. And by pure chance, 3 months earlier, or 2 months earlier, Stan had invited Begin to come and have lunch with him in his little house in Herzliya, Petua, after the election was over, assuming Begin wouldn't be busy after the election. And Begin had accepted. So this luncheon happened to be scheduled, just a private luncheon in the house, for 4 days after the election. So when I got there, Stan said, "Mr. Ambassador, I want you to know something. I'm having lunch with Menachem Begin next week, early next week, and I think you ought to come. It would be a terrific opportunity for you to meet him before he gets into office." Well, that seemed to be quite an idea. So I thought, great, but maybe I better do a little checking. I had not yet presented my credentials to the outgoing foreign minister, Yigal Allon. I had called on the Director General of the Foreign Ministry, Epi Evron, who was later on Israeli ambassador in Washington, preliminarily, but I hadn't yet presented credentials. So I thought there might be some diplomatic sensitivity here that I better take a sounding on. And I called Epi and asked his advice. And he very strongly advised me not to do it. He said he was sure that given the mood that the Labor Party, which was still the government, Rabin still Prime Minister, Allon still Foreign Minister, that they would take it very amiss if I met with the leader of the next Prime Minister before I even formally presented credentials. This would be a diplomatic gaffe. I would get off on the wrong foot, and so on. Good diplomatic advice, actually. So I went back to Stan. I said, Stan, I've had this advice. I think he's right. I better not do it. And to his everlasting credit, the next day, Stan came in to me and he said, Mr. Ambassador, I know what you said, but I want you to think about this. And he made the arguments all over again why this would be a very unusual opportunity. And he persuaded me to change my mind. So I did it. And I'd say of all the decisions I made in Israel, it's probably the smartest thing I ever did, because we had about 3 hours, just the three of us, around the kitchen table in Stan's little house. Begin was delighted to have this opportunity to get to know me. He was very much seeking, what's the word, I guess, legitimization. He had been an opposition leader all of his life, an underground leader, despised by Ben-Gurion, pushed out to the outer fringes of Israeli political society, demeaned and denigrated. He was a real outsider in every sense. And now he was going to become prime minister finally after running for office 8 times and being defeated. And he was the Harold Stassen of Israeli politics until that election. And every way in which he could feel he was now in the big time accepted as legitimate national leader meant a lot to him psychologically. And somehow meeting with the new American ambassador before he became prime minister was important to him. So anyway, we both wanted to meet each other. I obviously had a great motivation to try to get to know him, particularly because no one in Washington really knew him at all. No one in the State Department had any sense of what he was like. The journalists didn't really know much about him. Time magazine's files, the Time correspondent told me, had 2 pieces of paper in them, both 20 years old when they went to do a cover story on him, and so forth. So I was in a very unique position to be the first American to really get to know Begin and try to convey what his election meant to the new administration. Carter had only been in office 4 or 5 months at this point. We spent 3 hours together around that table. Basically, I listened and he talked and I asked questions. And he began to educate me about himself and about his view of Jewish history. And of course, Begin was, his greatest preoccupation really was the history of the Jewish people, its tragedies, and as he would put it, its ultimate triumphs. It was very informal. He got on a first name basis with me. I never called him Menachem because of the difference in our ages and positions, but he treated me very much like a colleague after that, not like a foreign ambassador. And the result was that for several months at least, Begin was a little confused, I think, as to what the role of the American ambassador was. He tended to use me much more like he would the Israeli ambassador to convey messages. And the center of gravity of our relationship very much moved to Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, rather than through Simcha Dinitz, who had been the very able and very influential Israeli ambassador in Washington under the Labor Party, and remained on for about a year under Begin. But he was never fully trusted by Begin. He was a labor man and a bit slick at times, and had been very close to Kissinger. Never was quite as close to the Carter people in any case. But Begin, starting with this first interview, I think saw me as a potential friend, not only a personal friend, but also a friend of Israel. So he tended to use me as his ambassador. Eventually, he began to understand that that wasn't my job, and I had to gently remind him on occasion that this wasn't really this wasn't my role. He had somebody else to do that. And over time, it became more normal. But that first interview was extraordinary. I liked him. I didn't find him to be an ogre or a barbarian. I was impressed with his dedication and his courage and certainly his grasp of history and his desire not to be somebody who took Israel into another war, which is the public image he had at the time. But rather, he convinced me in that first meeting that his greatest desire was to be the person who finally achieved peace for Israel. So I never doubted really his motivation after that. Certainly I had lots of troubles with him later on. He was a tough man to deal with. He was very, very nasty at times, histrionic, manipulative, a great actor. But his basic instincts were those of a patriot and someone who admired the United States. Didn't know the United States very well, though he'd been here a number of times. But he had a great admiration for our system of government, our president. The American president for Begin was an enormous kind of role model and someone to look up to, whomever the American president. So even when he was fighting with Carter, as he frequently did, and later with less with Reagan, he had a great admiration for American society and for our system of government. And this gave us a kind of bond which got us over a lot of rough spots. Now, his personality was really so different from Carter's or Sadat's, certainly, that it is quite extraordinary that they managed ultimately to find a way to work together despite the huge differences in history and perspective on the world. He was, above all, a Jewish nationalist, haunted by the Holocaust in which his family had all perished, shadowed by his history of imprisonment by the Russians, fiercely anti-communist, proud, very proud, and easily offended, and tiresome in his preoccupation with legalisms. Begin had studied to be a lawyer and actually loved jurisprudence and loved parsing documents and letters and words and finding legal implications in them and arguing from legal texts, things which made Sadat just absolutely bored silly and Carter quite impatient. And he was a very tough negotiator. I don't think I've ever run into a better one. Better in the sense that he usually got what he wanted. He had a way in negotiating of seizing on an issue, a small issue, usually a textual question, and building it up and concentrating on it and hammering away at it and driving everybody absolutely crazy. And then eventually, when he had finally to make some concession in the negotiation, he would give a concession on this kind of issue of form and thereby avoid giving much of a concession on substance. But everybody by this time would be so relieved to get some kind of concession out of him that they would think they'd achieved a great triumph. And if you look at the Camp David conference and what Begin was after when he went there, and what Sadat was after, and what Carter was after, I don't think there's any question but that Begin was the winner. He was the better negotiator at Camp David. He got more of what he wanted out of Camp David certainly than Carter, and some more than Sadat. Sadat wanted the Sinai above all else, and he got the Sinai. So you can't say he was a loser. But he wanted a good deal more, and he didn't get the good deal more in any real sense. That's a long diatribe about
Just
Begin.
to focus in on one aspect of the Camp David Accords, there was this obvious difference that the different parties had over the question of the settlement freeze, which Brzezinski and Carter and Vance take one perspective of, and I guess Begin took another. Do you have, from your perspective, any insight into that particular quarrel?
Yeah, I've looked into this quarrel a lot because I was charged to try to straighten it out after it happened, and I was never able to. I think it's pretty simple. I'm convinced, unlike Carter, but Bill Quandt, who was also at Camp David, agrees. We agree really on what we think happened. Mind you, we weren't present, and they were. The only 5 people in the room when this discussion took place at 2 o'clock in the morning on Saturday night at the end of the Camp David conference after a 4-hour meeting were Vance, Diane, Carter, Begin, and Barak. Brzezinski was not present, and we weren't present. Right after that, after they finished that discussion, however, Vance came back and debriefed to Bill Quandt and me and others, Hal Saunders and others. And Bill has gone over his notes recently about this with me. We talked about it quite recently. Carter went back and wrote down his impressions of what happened, as he did after every meeting. And he presumably briefed Brzezinski. Barak, the Attorney General, who was really one of the unsung heroes of the Camp David Conference, was the note taker on the Israeli side. Diane and Begin didn't take notes. And Barak's precision and integrity has been widely acknowledged by Carter as well as by anybody who's ever dealt with him. And after the disagreement arose, I was charged to try to get Begin to change his mind and to admit that he had in fact promised an indefinite freeze that night and then changed his mind overnight, which is Carter's opinion of what happened. I went to Begin, I went to Diane, I spent hours with both of them. I spent a long time with Barak to try to figure out what had really happened. And this is what I'm convinced happened. They were indeed all very tired. The issue of a settlements freeze was the only thing seemingly remaining to be resolved to get the agreement. They'd been at it for 13 days or 12 days at this point. Everybody had a lot riding on not allowing this conference to fail at the very last moment. Carter pressed Begin for a commitment for a settlements freeze for the duration of the negotiations. Now, Carter clearly meant by the duration of the negotiations however long it takes to get an autonomy agreement. It was the target at that point that this could be done in 3 months or 6 months, but there was no way of knowing how long it would take. Begin pressed very hard, finally said something like, I'll get back to you in the morning, or I will. He certainly, I think, in his mind and in the notes that Barak took, did not give a clear response. A response which Carter might well have interpreted as meaning a yes, but Begin not meaning a yes, that he had to think about it overnight. And Vance, debriefing after the meeting, said something like, "Well, I think we've got it, but I'm not sure." Carter writes down in his notes, Begin promised a settlements freeze. Then the next morning, but clearly Begin promised to get back to him with the letter, which he was seeking this commitment in a letter. He would give him a letter in the morning. Early the next morning, Carter goes walking with Sadat and tells Sadat, "I've got it." Half an hour later, the letter is delivered to Carter's cabin. And what it says is, Begin will agree to promise or to commit to a freeze on settlement activities for 3 months. Or I don't remember whether it says 3 months or says for the duration of the negotiations over the peace treaty. It was one or the other. The point here is that there was a firm 3 months target for putting the peace treaty with Egypt into formal treaty language. And they all thought this would be quite easy to do. In fact, it took 6 months and was a lot more difficult than anyone expected. But the framework was all agreed. And Carter was incensed. He said, this isn't what he agreed to. He agreed to a settlements freeze for the time, for the duration of the negotiations over the autonomy agreement, which was expected to run much longer. Settlements freeze doesn't have anything to do with the treaty with Egypt. He's double-crossed me. He's backed off. He's changed his mind. He's had second thoughts. He hands the letter to Hal Saunders, who I think had been given it to deliver to him. He says, "Hal, take this back and get it right. Get him to give us the right letter." Carter never went back to Begin that day on this issue. He had already told Sadat that he had the deal. He wasn't about to admit he didn't. He didn't want anything to disturb the last moments. Then we get back to Washington. And of course, Saunders does what he's asked to do, and Begin's response is, "No, this is what I've agreed to." So there's an impasse, and everybody just ignores it and goes through the last-minute drama of the Jerusalem issue, which comes up in the afternoon, and then finally we get that resolved and fly back and have the big ceremony in the East Room that night to announce the accord. Within 24 hours, Brzezinski has given a backgrounder to the press, saying that Carter had obtained a firm commitment to a settlements freeze for the duration of the negotiations. Begin, reading the stories the next morning, is incensed. And the Israelis do their backgrounding to set the record straight. Then, to really make matters worse, and meanwhile Carter has made no effort directly to straighten this out with Begin. He has told Vance to get it straightened out, and Vance has asked Saunders and me to try to get it straightened out, and Saunders and I continue to make efforts with the Begin and his party, and we get nowhere. Then Begin speaks to a joint session, then Carter speaks to the joint session of Congress. You remember that dramatic event? It was really something. And in his speech, he again says that we have this settlements freeze. So Carter has really nailed his own position firmly to the wall by this point in a way that he cannot back off. And yet Begin has not changed a bit in what he's committed to. So then I'm sent back to Israel shortly thereafter to get this straightened out. And as I say, I never succeeded. And it remained, the issue then remained, I think, the single most troubling aspect of the U.S.-Israeli relationship for the rest of the time that Carter was in office. Carter is absolutely convinced to this day that Begin double-crossed him. that overnight he changed his mind after having committed to something. Vance, I think, is not quite so firmly committed of that. I'm convinced there was a genuine misunderstanding that night of what was said and what it meant, and from fatigue and from perhaps lack of an American note-taker who was not part of the conversation, because Vance and Carter were both involved in the conversation. But then the egos got involved, and Begin got very offended that Carter thought he had lied to him or had double-crossed him. And their relationship, which had always been difficult, but was really pretty amazingly successful given their differences of temperament and backgrounds, their relationship started to head downhill with this event. And it got really steadily worse throughout the rest of the Carter administration. They kept on the formal level, they communicated, they treated each other politely, but the warmth and the trust which had gradually built up between them was really pretty much dissipated over this event. And I think our failure to be able to move more rapidly through the peace treaty negotiations was partly because of the distrust that had been planted over this settlement's misunderstanding or disagreement. And the length of time that we struggled with the autonomy negotiations unsuccessfully, it was in some sense also a result, because this relationship between the U.S. and Israel is so unique, as I said in the lecture last night, that the relationship between the two leaders is crucial. And when there is trust, when there is a sense of open communication, even about subjects in which you disagree very sharply, it works. When the worm of the discord and of distrust begins to eat at it, it gets very sticky. And it got stickier and stickier after these events.
You seem to be saying between the lines that the critical juncture was when Carter got the letter in the morning. He should have gone and seen Begin directly and get it settled.
Exactly.
Do you think that he possibly believed that it was unresolvable given their discussions, and that he was going to use this opportunity to sort of hide behind a misunderstanding rather than endanger the agreement?
Carter is not, I've never found Carter to be a very Machiavellian, scheming type personality. I think he's a pretty straightforward man. And I think he genuinely thought Begin had changed his mind. He overestimated his ability to bring Begin back into line afterward. And he didn't want to run the risk of telling Sadat, well, I was mistaken. No, I think he really thought, A, that Begin had changed his mind, and B, we'll just get him to unchange it.
But he's also not a confrontational person. That is, that would be the kind of discussion that he wouldn't relish. Is that your impression?
Well, I don't know that he certainly hadn't, he'd had some very sharp confrontations with Begin before. And while he's not, perhaps he's not confrontational by choice, he had never backed away from some very stiff arguments with Begin. So I don't think it was that. I think he was afraid of having a confrontation at that moment, which would put at risk the delicately balanced agreement that was on the point of being signed. He didn't want to ruffle Sadat. He didn't want to have a fight with Begin personally at that moment and have something else come unraveled. But I think he was quite convinced that Begin would go back to his original agreement when the time came.
Ambassador Lewis, can I pick up on what Alex was sort of getting at, and that is the underpinnings of this whole question is your assessment of Jimmy Carter. As you know, he came in with Brzezinski and Quandt having participated in that Brookings study and certain preconceived notions about an area that he had relatively little familiarity with.
That's right.
And I would be interested in your assessment of his character, his understanding, and how it evolved in this whole process.
I always found both Carter and Begin absolutely fascinating political personalities. my angle on Carter is obviously only one angle, and he had lots of other angles, but I saw him as a kind of composite of several different personalities. In the first place, he clearly was and is deeply religious, genuinely so, and very much a kind of missionary bent in Carter to do good works and to make peace and to build houses for the poor and so forth, and to mediate between adversaries. I think that stems from his very deep religious commitments and experience. But he was also an ex-naval officer and nuclear engineer. And his national security side was very much there, and it came out of this military background. So he wasn't just a peacenik, yet he had a big peacenik dimension to him. And the two things often clashed. Then in addition, he was an engineer, is an engineer, I guess. And he approached his problems as an engineer. Every problem has a solution if only you understand it well enough and put the pieces together properly and work at it. He has a tremendous work ethic which convinces them that persistence and just grinding away at a problem and doing it rationally, and you can persuade people to accept rational decisions if you just work at it long enough and hard enough. What he didn't have, in my perception, was any real political instincts. He was a bad politician. He was a self-made politician. He wasn't very successful as a governor for that reason because of difficulties with his legislature. He didn't have a feel for the political process, whether it's in Washington or certainly in the Middle East. He did have, in addition, with respect to the Middle East, this long-standing emotional connection to the Holy Land. And that made him particularly motivated to try his best to bring peace to the Holy Land. He didn't know any Jews, or very few Jews, before he became president. He didn't know any Israelis. And his learning curve about Israel and about the layered complications of the Jewish experience and the role of Jerusalem in that experience and the effect of the Holocaust on this everybody's against us psychology that I was discussing last night. All of that he learned in the course of these negotiations, and he learned a lot of it from his dealings with Menachem Begin and from reading and being briefed. And he became, over the months, much more sensitive. But he didn't start out with any of this sensitivity. He saw the Middle East peace problem as one that was susceptible of a rational solution. You just get the Arabs and the Israelis together and lay out rational ways for them to solve their differences, and ultimately they can be persuaded to accept rational solutions. Well, he became more and more aware of how irrational that region is and how deep-seated are the animosities. But he never lost the conviction that enough effort and persistence, you can overcome a lot of that irrationality. With Begin, their bond, what made it work between them, when it did work, was their religiosity, their mutual connection with this strange part of the world, their biblical intersections. The fact that they could quote biblical passages back and forth to each other was a big help. Begin could appeal to Carter through the Bible and through the religious dimension. Carter could respond because he had that dimension, even when they were deeply disagreeing about the substance of an issue. And this enabled them to get around periods of great nastiness on the diplomatic front. And I think, finally, with respect to Carter, if you one of the interesting aspects of Carter's approach toward the Middle East was his preoccupation with the Palestinians and their plight of the Palestinians. No previous president had paid much attention to the Palestinians. They looked on the issue as a state-to-state conflict, and that's the way the Israelis had wanted to look at it, but had finally, slowly been forced to recognize there was another nation here that had to be somehow dealt with. Begin never quite got that far. He didn't really accept that, but little by little, he was being dragged in that direction by events. Carter saw the Palestinians somehow, I'm convinced, very much through the optic of the civil rights movement in the United States. He had had a lot of deep involvement with civil rights, and he really saw an identification between their plight and the plight of the blacks in the South. And he one time said to a group of us in a fit of anger, we were discussing some aspect of the negotiation, he said, "I'm convinced none of you, nobody cares about the Palestinians except me," referring to all the Americans involved and the Israelis and the other Arabs. And I think this Palestinian dimension of Carter went back to his involvement with civil rights movement here, and somehow saw them as...
Could you comment on Carter's, the extent of his involvement with Palestinians?
Well, he didn't know very many Palestinians. He began to meet quietly with one or two American Palestinians. He read a lot about it after he got out of office, and he was no longer inhibited by the unfortunate commitment that Kissinger had made back in the 70s, and which Carter inadvertently, I think, extended. The commitment not to deal or even talk to the PLO, that was a big inhibition for Carter getting to know any Palestinians, because the ones he would normally get to know had some connection with the PLO. But he did, in quiet ways, meet a few over the time. And when he was in Jerusalem, I guess there were no meetings with Palestinians during that period. But various people around Carter from time to time would find ways to give him a little bit of access to the Palestinian point of view. And I think most of it he got really through reading and watching television clips, and not so much in personal interaction with individuals. Since he's been out of office, of course, he's dealt a great deal with Palestinians and has gotten to know a lot of them personally, and I think they've just reinforced his very positive opinion of their plight.
It's a very compelling picture you're creating. Could you plug Vance into that? That is how...
Okay, Vance was the consummate lawyer.
Mm-hmm.
A man is, I should say, he's still very much active and doing great work. Cy Vance is, to my money, perhaps the finest person I've ever encountered in public life. And working for Cy was a true honor and delight. And the fact that he was the Secretary of State made it possible for me to get through a lot of situations that otherwise might have been just too difficult to manage. He had Carter's full confidence, I think. On the Middle East, the differences that arose between Vance and Brzezinski, the different points of view about the world, which were very much in the foreground with respect to East-West matters. The Middle East Arab-Israeli front, they didn't affect it. So far as I could tell, one of the nicest things about working for the Carter administration, quite contrary to the Reagan administration, incidentally, was that you really had a team on the Middle East. You had
Except
a
Iran.
coherent team. Well, that's right. I guess I'm really talking about the Arab-Israeli part of it. I didn't deal with the Iran issue, so you're right. There was a split on Iran. But on the Arab-Israeli issues, clearly Carter was the quarterback. He was calling all the signals, and everybody was playing on his team. Harold Brown was a very cooperative and important player from the defense side. Brzezinski and Vance got along quite smoothly on Arab-Israeli matters, and they all had the same basic intellectual point of view. So you didn't have the problem of instructions being countermanded or whipsawing between agencies, which we saw a lot of in the Reagan years. Now Vance, because he just exuded personal integrity and goodwill, and he had the ideal personality for a mediator representing a great power in this sense. He didn't wave the power around, he carried it with him. He bent over backwards to listen and to try to understand. He never lost his temper. He understood the personal problem, the hang-ups of the Israelis, and came to be on very close personal terms with Begin and with the others, with Dayan in particular. Dayan and Vance hit it off very well, and he worked closely with Dayan to try to come up with creative diplomatic solutions to problems that Begin would want to deal with in more legalistic and confrontational terms. And so often Vance and Dayan were, in a sense, scheming in a proper kind of way to find a way around a problem which Begin and Carter couldn't engage together on. Vance was very good also at using the team that he had working for him in the State Department and in using us in the key embassies in the area as part of that team. So both Carter and his staff and Vance and his immediate staff all brought Herman Eilts in Cairo and me and our staffs very much into the picture at all stages, and worked through us and used us as instruments and listened to our advice, sometimes even took it, had us in the meetings. It was really a very satisfactory team operation from the point of view of a career professional, and certainly not characteristic of some other administrations. Not the way Kissinger behaved, certainly not the way Baker behaves. So Vance, I think, was a tremendous asset in the peace process, both to Carter and to the process itself.
Could I ask you one more thing? I was fascinated by what you were saying about Begin's sense of history. And did he have a sense of what the historical relationship was between the Jews and the Arabs? That is, my perception is that Begin and others, when they speak about their sense of history, it really is the Jewish people from biblical times to the present and finally getting their state. And the Arabs don't play largely in that.
Begin never knew any Arabs, never understood the Arabs, never had the slightest empathy for the Arabs. They were just spear carriers on the stage of history.
Right.
And he had been immersed in the Jewish tragedies of the 20th century. He didn't have any space left in his mind for other people's problems. Not just Arabs, but Americans. Begin could never empathize with the United States about an issue, or with the British, much less, given his personal history with the British. He admired, by the way, he admired the British system, and he liked individual Britishers. He idealized the British Parliament and the British parliamentary system, and his very correct parliamentary style in Israel derived from that. He was a real Democrat in the sense that he believed in parliamentary democracy and in the rules of the game and how you treat the opposition, and he was offended by the way the Israeli Knesset goes off in all sorts of odd directions. It's a raucous place, unlike the parliament. But his worldview barely had Arabs in it, except as enemies. I mean, his only experience with Arabs was as enemies, and his only perception of the Palestinians was as either terrorists or enemies or people living under benign Israeli rule. And it went beyond the Arabs, though, as I suggested. Often I would try to get across to Begin how the U.S. problems, economic problems, domestic problems, world problems, impacted on what we were able to do or not do with respect to this particular set of issues. he would listen politely. He just didn't get it. I mean, he couldn't put himself in anybody's skin psychologically but another Jew's. He was immersed in Jewish history.
Could you plug Sadat into this now? How was it, you know, how did that play? What was the synergies between the three, and what did players on the side contribute to making that work? Because so far it seems like this is a very unlikely collection
It really was.
of people. So in some sense, Camp David was a diplomatic miracle of sorts. How were the three bought into this?
Well, I think you have to go back to the beginning of Sadat's visit. Sadat had reached the conclusion by the time the Carter administration took office and by the time Begin was elected 4 months later, that Egypt was in a blind alley. Their economy was going down the tube. They'd had food riots. They could not find their way out of their economic situation unless they could get the weight of the war off their back and get foreign investment coming in again and so forth. Moreover, he had launched that 73 surprise attack, I think genuinely to regain enough Egyptian honor on the one hand to be able to go into negotiations and also to force the United States to get active in the negotiations again and impose a settlement. So from 73 on, or 74 on, when Kissinger's shuttle diplomacy produced then the first two disengagement agreements, Sadat was on the road toward a deal with Israel. The road was clearly laid out and he was moving down it. But that was, he confronted a new situation when Carter was elected. He knew what he was dealing with in Kissinger, and they had understood each other rather well. Carter early on met with Sadat in the early spring of his administration. They hit it off personally. And clearly Carter admired then and continues to admire Sadat today as one of the great figures of modern history and the person he felt closest to. He didn't conceal that. And he didn't conceal it from Begin. And Begin was always enormously jealous of Sadat. Begin wanted to be the primary ally of the American president. He wanted the Israeli-American connection, and particularly his relationship with the American president, to take primacy. He liked Sadat, but he thought Sadat was kind of an actor and kind of a little slippery. But he admired Sadat also, and he certainly admired him for coming to Jerusalem. And he found he liked Sadat a whole lot more than Sadat liked him. This was one of Begin's problems. He liked Sadat more than Sadat liked him, and he liked Carter more than Carter liked him. And they both managed to conceal that for a while, but as the negotiations went on and the press stories describing things proliferated, Begin began to understand that he really was, once again, the outsider, the Jew who isn't quite accepted. And that began to infect his relationship with both Sadat and Carter, but especially Sadat, I think, in this case, toward the end of his period. He kept coming back to trying to engage Sadat. He kept trying to reach a sort of an intimate, genuine personal rapport with Sadat. And Egyptians, among all the Arabs, are the nicest personally to deal with because they really don't like personal confrontation, and they say yes and smile and talk very nicely, unlike the Syrians who are quite stiff. So Sadat, when he was with Begin and in some of their communications, would give Begin the impression that peace was really growing between the two of them. But in fact, Sadat was more and more convinced in private that Begin was hopeless, and he could only rely on Jimmy Carter to force Begin to do what had to be done. And there was then this peculiar trilateral relationship. Begin had one chance after the Jerusalem trip. The Jerusalem visit for Sadat was an eye-opener. He, great ego, great poser in some respects, great statesman, interested in the big picture, hated details. Begin loved details, and they didn't communicate there on that level at all. But when Sadat made this enormous political leap of coming to Jerusalem, he assumed that Begin would understand that it was necessary for Israel to do something equally dramatic in response. Begin, on the other hand, thought, well, finally he's seen the light. He understands. So now we can sit down and really negotiate a deal. The high point of the possibility of the bilateral relationship being sufficient came that Christmas Day meeting in Ismailia in 1977, when the two heads of government met with their key advisors without the U.S. involved at all. We were not players. We weren't present. We were just merely being informed along the way. And that period from the Jerusalem visit in November through Christmas was the high point of bilateralism in the Israeli-Egyptian peace negotiations. Sadat wanted a quick deal. He wanted a quick deal because the Arab opposition was mobilizing. He really didn't give a damn about the Palestinians. He wanted Sinai. What he wanted was a simple declaration of principles which would give enough appearance that Israel was going to take care of the Palestinian problem, that he could go on and settle the Sinai bilaterally and get away with it. Begin, of course, coming from a very different direction, concerned about the details of every aspect of Israel's security arrangements, wanting to be absolutely sure that whatever he was committed to was something he could ultimately deliver, had come up with this autonomy idea, which was really the most that he was ever going to be prepared to do in his own mind for the Palestinians. And he wanted to get Sadat to sign on to this autonomy arrangement, which he could then say is, we have agreed this is what the Palestinians shall have. Both of them really didn't care about the Palestinians, but they realized they had to do something to deal with the Palestinian issue. And Begin's approach and Sadat's approaches were light years apart. So they get together at Ismailia, and Sadat is presented with this detailed autonomy scheme. Last thing he wanted to see, he didn't want to sign on to something which would sound to the Palestinians like he had sold them out. He just wanted Begin to agree to some vague language about Palestinian rights and their rights to self-determination, and then he could say, okay, now it's up to you. I've got the principles. You can work out the details. They talk past each other totally. And the irony of it is, from Begin's point of view, this was a terrible missed opportunity. If you look at the language in the Camp David agreement that was hammered out laboriously by Carter and the rest of us over the next 8 months, 9 months, and the language which Sadat was seeking in that Declaration of Principles at Ismailia, Begin actually gave away, finally, some phrases about the Palestinians that he wouldn't have had to agree to. He actually gave away more on the Palestinian side of the issue in order to get the deal at Camp David than he would have had to give at Ismailia. And you could have had, I believe, the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel with much less U.S. involvement, probably, much earlier, and without all of the negative complications that the long months of back and forth and anger and frustration produced between January and September. Had Begin been more farsighted, less preoccupied with his own concerns, but that's asking him to be something he couldn't be. The Israelis came back from Ismailia with the commitment which Begin heralded. We've agreed to set up 2 committees, one to work out military arrangements, one to deal with political issues. 2 joint committees. This was all they accomplished at Ismailia. Dayan, when he got off the airplane, I was out at the airport to meet the Israeli delegation. When they came back, Begin made one of his grandiloquent speeches about how well they got along with the Egyptians, a great triumph. And of course, Sadat wasn't trying to dramatize the problem. He was still hoping for a solution. So he didn't say much back in Cairo to rebut. But Dayan knew what had happened and saw what terrible opportunity had been missed. And he stomped off while Begin was speaking and got in his car, and I caught up with him and we chatted for a few minutes. And he was as depressed as I've ever seen the man. And he said, you know, Begin lost it. He blew it. Idiot. Various comments of that sort. Dayan privately was often very disdainful of Begin, while he understood Begin had the political power and he didn't. And he admired some aspects of his courage. He never approved of the way Begin went about negotiating. He disagreed with his approach toward Arabs in general, but he was determined somehow to help achieve peace, and so he managed to swallow hard and work with Begin. I might say one other word about Dayan, though, because it's a key point about what happened later on. Dayan, who was the one person in the government out of the old Labor Party history and a non-ideological approach, basically, toward problem solving, he found it was impossible to work the way Begin wanted him to work as foreign minister, which was to work under Begin's very close scrutiny. Dayan was a very independent-minded man anyway. So he would go off on trips or meetings with American officials or other foreign officials, and he would freewheel, he would explore ideas, he would raise possibilities, hypothetical options. He had a very fertile mind, and he concentrated 100% of his energies throughout those years on the peace process. He didn't care about anything else the foreign ministry did. He left it to other people to deal with all other issues, basically. He just worked 24 hours a day on this one, which didn't endear him, I might say, to his staff or to other people. But he got in trouble with Begin beginning in September of '77 when he negotiated a deal with Vance, so-called working paper, which was intended and did undermine the implication of the joint U.S.-Soviet statement about Middle East peacemaking, which we had negotiated secretly behind the Israelis' backs during late August and early September. Begin was very upset about it, Dayan, of course, too, and Dayan worked out an interpretation of that agreement, which essentially gutted it. Begin, however, was furious because Dayan had done this without checking every word back with him and just expecting him to accept it. Dayan thought that's what he ought to be doing as foreign minister. From that moment on, Begin said to some of his intimates, he'll never get away with that again. Well, in fact, he did get away with it frequently, but it poisoned that event and others like it, slowly poisoned Dayan's relationship with Begin. So Begin less and less trusted him to do what he was best at doing, which was turning difficult impasses into compromise solutions. It's why it took 6 months, I think, to get the peace treaty instead of 3. Dayan and Weizmann, who were leading the delegation, weren't trusted enough by Begin, weren't delegated enough authority. He insisted on holding everything much too much in his own hands on tiny details and drafting principles. So this psychology of Begin's, of having to get everything hammered out carefully, word for word, undermined his relationship with Sadat, eventually his relationship with Dayan, and made it very difficult for Carter to deal with him also.
Ambassador Luce, I'm wondering if we can shift gears now to another crucial event. That's the '82 war, where you have a new American president, a new Secretary of State, and in fact two eventually.
Yeah.
And you have another case of Begin's relationship with one of his subordinates being undermined, and that's, I guess, Ariel Sharon. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that war, in particular, one of the crucial questions that people have debated about, and that is whether there was a yellow light or a green light or what kind of light there was. And particularly, I guess, what I'd be interested in your assessment of is Sharon's conversation with Secretary of State Haig and the extent to which the Israelis perceived of the United States as having given them a signal and the extent to which we did.
Okay. Well, I'll give you my conclusion at the beginning. There was an amber light. There wasn't a red light. There certainly wasn't a green light. By the time Sharon came to Washington at the end of May in 1982, the die was, in all of our minds, pretty well cast. Israel was going to go into Lebanon in a fairly big way, though not, we didn't anticipate in the way they eventually did all the way to Beirut, when the provocation from the Palestinians in Lebanon gave a good opportunity. As far back as December, Sharon had started talking quite openly to Phil Habib and to me and to others about the need to clean out the PLO operations in Lebanon unless we got the PLO under control. That was always the way he put it. He, of course, would always cover himself by, when he would describe grandiose ideas about going to Beirut, if necessary. Say, these are my personal views. The cabinet hasn't considered these. I don't think they would ever agree with me, but I tell you, that's what I think. And you better understand that's what I think. And we'd heard this line from him over and over again in different places to different people from December all the way up to May. Meanwhile, we had consistently, Habib, who was then the president's representative wandering around out there frequently, myself, Al Haig directly. I don't think Reagan ever directly. Reagan was above all this. I mean, he was just kind of floated above the battle. All the American interlocutors essentially followed the same script when they talked to the Israelis about Lebanon. Yes, it's a very difficult situation. You're right. The Palestinian groups there have got to be brought under control. You have every right to defend yourselves if you're attacked. We wouldn't say that you don't have a right of self-defense. We would reserve that for ourselves as well. And we wouldn't pretend that any ally or friend of ours doesn't also have it. But you must understand that whatever you do in response to provocations has got to be commensurate with the extent of the provocation and the attack, proportionate in international legal terms, and has to be defensible, has to be understandable to the world. Otherwise, we won't be able to support you, nor will any of your other friends. That was the line the U.S. government followed throughout those months, warning, trying to convince them that it was unnecessary to talk about these retaliatory operations, promising on occasion to work with the Lebanese and hopefully with the Syrians, though we never had much success, to try to get the PLO to stand down its growing threat as they perceived it, and we to some extent agreed, though we felt they exaggerated the degree of the military threat. We couldn't deny that there was a buildup and there was a lot of provocative stuff going on in South Lebanon. So by the time Sharon comes at the end of May, I think Haig, and certainly I and Nick Veliotis, Assistant Secretary, practically everybody involved in this, had become resigned to the fact that at some point there was a big dust-up here just waiting to happen, and that when the Palestinians went too far, the Israelis were going to take the opportunity to really smack them hard. In South Lebanon, none of us believed or understood that Sharon had finally succeeded, after several failures, in selling the cabinet on somewhat bigger operation, though he never really sold them on what he did. And that's all described, I think, in Zev Schiff's book rather accurately. Sharon comes to Washington that week. He has a meeting with Al Haig and a number of others of us together, and he has several people with him. He brings out all the maps and he shows us what the Palestinians are doing, and he talks again about how they cannot stand by and allow this to go on, the threat to the northern villages, the Katyushas, and the rest. And then Haig gives a very clear statement of the U.S. policy line, which was the one I just described. Yes, you've really got problems, but it's important to let us continue to try to work on them. Phil Habib is going to Lebanon tomorrow or next week. We always, whenever the Israelis would come in with these kinds of presentations, would say, well, we're going to send Habib. He was our answer to try to hold them off from doing something military. And at some point in that conversation, Al said what I said earlier. Look, we would not deign to tell you you don't have the right of self-defense. You certainly do. But whatever you do in legitimate self-defense has to be understandable to the international community and proportionate to the degree of threat or provocation. Otherwise, we couldn't support you, others couldn't support you, so forth. Now, he never said, if you go into Lebanon, we'll cut off your water. There was no red light. The Reagan administration would never have said that. They didn't believe that. I mean, they saw Israel as an ally. They were very anti-PLO. They sympathized a lot with Israel's predicament. Yes, it complicated their relations with other Arabs, but they believed very strongly in the right of Israel to preemptively take out a threat as something that was intrinsically part of their national right. And I remember there was a discussion in which Reagan was involved about this issue that I heard of, question of self-defense, and it was clearly understood from the top down that we wouldn't allow anybody else to tell us we didn't have an unlimited right of self-defense, and we wouldn't tell the Israelis they didn't have it. But what we did try to do, Haig tried to do it in this conversation, was to urge them to exercise it in the most measured fashion possible when they felt they had to exercise it. Now, after this meeting, Nick Veliotis and I looked at each other. Knowing Sharon, we knew he would go back to Jerusalem and tell Begin, don't worry, the Americans won't do a thing. So we told Al Haig that, and that it's important that we send Begin a letter right away. Put down in writing what you said to Sharon, because he will report in a distorted fashion to the cabinet what you've heard here. Incidentally, in between those two events, Sharon met privately with Haig in his office for a brief period, 15, 20 minutes. Now, I have gone back to Al Haig on this, and he has been very persuasive that he never said anything which was different than what he said in the large meeting. He didn't give him any secret signals. And I believe him, but I do know that Haig was very sympathetic with Sharon's view of the PLO threat. And as a military man, he admired the Israeli military. And he may well have said some more encouraging things about what you might do if you have to do it than he would have said in the general meeting. But he didn't, I'm convinced he didn't violate the basic policy line we were trying to hold to. And he agreed it's important to send the letter to Begin. So we drafted a letter immediately. And as I remember, it was a Haig-Begin letter. But it might have been a Reagan-Begin letter. I don't know, you have to check the files on that. But Reagan would just have been the signatory. He wasn't involved in the drafting of it. The White House cleared it, I'm sure. And in that letter, we put down very carefully what had been said and what the warnings were and what we could support and what we couldn't support in the terms I've just described. I carried that letter back immediately to Tel Aviv, and I called Begin. Well, I don't have this sequence quite right because I didn't go back that same day. I had this chronology in my mind earlier, but I don't have it now. In any event, however I and the letter got back there, and whatever happened in between, and there were 2 or 3 days at least in between before the cabinet met for its fateful decision to launch the operation, I delivered that letter to Begin at 10 o'clock at night. He was meeting in his house in Jerusalem. I had it taken to him. He couldn't see me, but I got it into his hands through an emissary, through a courier, as he was going into this cabinet meeting. It may be that there was a delay in getting the letter signed, and I went back, and then when it finally got to me, it was the night of the fateful meeting. I just can't quite recall. In any case, I called him out of the cabinet meeting by phone, said I had to speak to him urgently. And I asked him if he had received the letter and if he understood what the secretary was saying. He was very angry with me, for calling him out of the cabinet meeting, and B, didn't want the letter. But it was very clear also from our conversation that Sharon had done exactly what we knew he would do, and that they had in effect made their decision, and that this letter was not strong enough because the letter, to change anything, because the letter was not a red light, and there was never any red light, but there wasn't any green light. And I think history is more complicated than this red-green sort of description that you get in some of the stories about the events.
Ambassador Lewis, I'm wondering if you could give us a little bit of insight into Ariel Sharon and his relationship with Menachem Begin. As you know, toward the end of Begin's life, the relationship had gotten rather bitter. And to the extent that you had substantial encounters with Sharon on the one hand, and maybe have some insight into Begin's perspective on it, we'd be interested in seeing both your reaction to that relationship, but also subsequent to that, some insight into Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Rabin.
Sharon is a very controversial character in Israel, with reason. He was the odd man out in the military. He was the general who was never part of the Labor Party, as most of the other generals had come from kibbutz background. His family had been loners. His mother was a loner. She was ostracized in the community where they grew up because they were not Labor Party supporters. And he's psychologically been fighting against the establishment all of his life. And he's continued to do that throughout his political career. He glories in being the guy who stands up against the establishment. Now, obviously, he was part of the Likud establishment as a key minister in Likud governments. His lifelong ambition was to be prime minister, still is, but he also wanted secondarily to be defense minister and get even with all those generals who had been nasty to him in the course of his career, and eventually actually forced him into retirement when he went into politics. He and Begin had a very problematical relationship. Begin had tremendous admiration for Arik's military accomplishments. He was a frustrated non-soldier himself. He had actually served in General Anders' army briefly during World War II in Russia, the Polish army in exile. But he was never really a military man, and as a commander of the Irgun in the underground, he was purely a civilian living in an underground hideaway much of the war, directing military, paramilitary, terrorist-type operations, but he never did any fighting. And he's one of those civilians who always had great admiration for the generals. Frustrated general himself, obviously. So Sharon, as one of the great tacticians of Israeli military history, and somebody who had been, as a field commander, daring and innovative and successful, Begin looked up to him. However, he thought him as a politician totally naive, crude, and often self-defeating. And he had very low regard for Sharon as a politician or as a statesman. Now, Sharon thought of himself as both, and his aspirations were clearly in both directions, more in the civilian side now than the military. Sharon also, while he respected Begin and his shrewdness, tended, I think, to ridicule him in private as far as his pretensions to be a defense minister. And Begin was acting defense minister for over a year after Ezer Weizman resigned. Begin never fully trusted Sharon with political power. He saw in him the authoritarian tendencies, the disdain for democracy and parliamentary procedures, the bully qualities that he has in considerable measure, as being something of a danger. And one time he was, I think, accurately quoted as saying, when he was having a big row with Sharon, he was quoted afterward as having said, Arik would bring the tanks around the Knesset if he had a chance. And I think that did catch something of his view of Sharon. But they were in a symbiotic situation after the middle of 1981. During the previous Begin government, which went out of office in June of '80, the first Begin government, which Dayan and Weizman were the two strong people, Sharon was Minister of Agriculture, and he was pushing ahead with the settlements program in the territories. And really, he is an extraordinarily determined bulldozer kind of politician who sets out on a course and nothing can divert him. He doesn't care about laws or regulations or orders. He achieves the objective. He told me once that his theory of warfare and generalship is you keep moving, expanding your territory. When you have to stop, you stop, but you never surrender ground. And when you can move forward again, you move forward. And that's the way he behaves in politics, exactly. Begin didn't want to make him Minister of Defense after Weizman resigned. He was unwilling to see him have that much power. And that's why he kept the job himself. But after the election of 1981, very narrow election in which Labor Party lost only at the very last moment through a screw-up in their campaign, Sharon ended up with 3 very loyal members of the Likud within the Likud list, but they were his men. And he threatened Begin, either you give me Ministry of Defense or I'm going to pull out of the Likud. We'll set up our own faction. So Begin was strong-armed into giving him the ministry. He never forgot that, incidentally. Begin didn't like to be muscled politically. But he had no choice, ultimately. He had to form the government. He needed Sharon, and he knew Sharon would carry through on his threat. Throughout that next 2 years with Sharon as defense minister, up until he was forced out by the Kahan Commission report on Sabra and Shatila in January, February of '83, Sharon was the strong man in the cabinet, and he was manipulating Begin a lot on Lebanon issues in particular. Now, mind you, he and Begin saw eye to eye on the PLO, but not on tactics and not on diplomacy, not on a lot of things. Sharon isolated Begin rather skillfully at the beginning of that period by forcing Begin to drop his longtime military secretary, Froike Paran, who was a very able senior officer who was the liaison for the Prime Minister to the Defense Minister and had been there for a long time and knew where all the bodies were buried in the interstices of the MOD. Forcing Paran out and putting in a more junior colonel in his place forced Begin essentially to rely on Sharon for all his information about what was going on in the defense area. And Sharon also intimidated his chief of intelligence from reporting separately and honestly to the cabinet and to Begin, as had been the tradition before that of chiefs of military intelligence, and only talking when Sharon was present and saying the things Sharon wanted said. So little by little, he basically got control of the situation militarily and led Begin into the Lebanon War. Now, it isn't that the Lebanon War was something Begin wasn't enthusiastic about, but he had a different concept of what it was all about, and Sharon managed to flim-flam him until it was too late, and Begin was very much involved and committed. Their objective was not different, but their diplomatic tactics and their political tactics were quite different. By the time the war was over, Begin had become very disenchanted with Sharon. He had finally become convinced that Sharon was ordering military operations around Beirut and lying to him about them. And Begin then would catch all the flack from Reagan and from Schultz and from me and from others. But he was relaying the information about facts on the ground that he was being provided by Sharon, and then it would turn out to be false. And Begin would be the one who suffered because his personal relationship with Reagan, which he also treasured and had cultivated, began to come unstuck as Begin's own credibility was diminished by Sharon's activities. They had, therefore, an increasingly difficult relationship toward the end of the war. And then when the Sabra and Shatila massacres occurred, and Begin first reacted very defensively and unwisely to the idea that a massacre carried out by Christian phalangists was being blamed on the Jews, he ultimately realized that this event was devastating for his world position and for Israel's positions. And he was brought before the dock of the Kahan Commission as a result of something Arik had permitted to happen. So after Arik was driven out of the Ministry of Defense, Begin still didn't throw him out of the cabinet, showing how much of a hold Sharon, in a sense, had over him politically. And the later months of Begin's life as Prime Minister, until he retired voluntarily in the summer of '83, he was in this enormous depression after his wife died. He was not eating, and that reinforced the depression, so that by the time the summer came and he was ready finally to see his friend Ronald Reagan again for the first time since before the Lebanon War, he no longer had the will or the energy or the psychological drive to continue. He was politically still perfectly in control of the situation. The party begged him to stay on. He was not physically disabled. He was able to come to the office every day. He could read, he could act, but he had lost totally his spark. I was with him a lot in that period, and he was very unlike himself. We were carrying on the negotiations for the Lebanon Agreement, and George Shultz was there, and Habib was there off and on. And whereas the old Begin would have always been over every line of every negotiating document and put his own stamp on every word, this Begin in the spring of '83 would sit, listen passively to the briefings from Habib or from his own people, make one or two comments, ask a question, say, well, that's fine. He had lost the energy, the drive to govern. And he had a very great sense of responsibility about the prime ministry and about Israel. And he finally concluded, because he wasn't doing the job in the way he knew he could do it or should do it, he had to leave it. It's an extraordinary case, the only case I know of a democratic leader of a democratic country still totally in control politically. No question that he could have finished out his term without difficulty. Physically able to act and mentally able to act, making a decision in his mind really for the good of the nation, that better he step aside. And then he did, and went into seclusion for the rest of his life.
Do you think the main issue was the '82 war, or was it his wife's death?
I think the main issue was his depression, but the depression was a pattern. He'd had these periods of depression throughout his life. And I'd watched him go through about 3 of them. They usually lasted a month or 6 weeks or 2 months. But in every prior case, and I think the triggering event for the depression was the Sabra and Shatila affair and his realization of what had happened and how Israel's responsibility was involved, and maybe how Arik had misled him. But once he was in the depression, his wife's illness and then her death is what prolonged it. Always before Aliza Begin, who was his only real close, intimate confidant about everything, she had gotten him out of these depressions. She had fed him, she had encouraged him, she had re-pumped up his tires. And then he would come out of them and he'd go back redoubled in his energy. And this time, by the time in November, when she died, he went into a deeper depression about his death, and there was a sense of guilt because he'd gone to the United States against his own better judgment, leaving her in the hospital. The doctors said, "Don't worry, go make your trip, go see Ronald Reagan. She's fine, she's doing very well." And he went, and then she died when he got to Los Angeles, and he felt guilt about that as well. It was a complicated series of guilts and depression issues. But I think the real key factor was she wasn't there to get him out of that depression. And so it just continued. And he never really came out of it fully.
Before we go over to some other questions that I know we have, could we ask for some cameo sketches of Alexander Haig and George Shultz as Secretaries of State to sort of follow on your discussions of Vance?
Well, 2 more different people than Vance and Haig you'd have a hard time finding. I got along very well, incidentally, with all 3 of these people, so I was very lucky. They all seemed to approve of the way I behaved and listened to me enough, so I felt like it was worth working for them. Haig had a different view of the Middle East, a different view of Israel. He was very much more supportive of Israel and Israel's military in particular. He had a long set of relationships with a number of Israeli politicians and generals going back through his NATO years and earlier, and the Nixon years. And he had a tremendous admiration for a lot of aspects of Israel. He didn't get along too well with or like very much Menachem Begin, though he made out as if he did. Haig was a pretty good actor when he wanted to be also. He clearly had a concept about how to deal with Israel and the Middle East, which he sold to the Reagan administration, which 10 years later turns out to have been right, but at the time it ran against directly the conventional wisdom, as I said last night at the lecture. He was paranoid, secretive, suspicious. Sure, everybody was out to get him, and a lot of people were. He handled himself unwisely in the Reagan administration because he really thought Reagan was going to be a president like Nixon had been, and he was looking on Nixon as the model president for whom he had worked. And when Reagan didn't behave like Nixon, didn't really take charge, and he had to work with all of this Troika crowd and White House staff as sort of an amorphous administration, he couldn't find his way through it. He never figured out how to operate successfully in that California Reagan milieu. And it made him more and more nervous, tense, suspicious, paranoid, and all the rest. And he really shot himself in the foot and finally resigned once too many times, and they accepted it. But as far as the Middle East was concerned, the track he was on vis-a-vis Israel and Syria and the PLO was, I think, potentially perhaps a more fruitful track than the one we then went into with Shultz. Shultz I have a tremendous admiration for also. I think he's a great person, a very wise person, and not terribly creative, but a wonderful person to draw on his staff, to use people correctly, to handle a major cabinet post, and very wise about Washington. He also had a good sense of identification with Israel. He was feared by the Israelis initially because he'd worked for Bechtel and he'd been involved with the Saudis, but they came to understand fairly early on that actually he had a very sympathetic view of Israel. He had visited there while he was Secretary of Labor, and he had a graduate student when he was at the University of Chicago who had left the week before he was to get his, defend his dissertation to go back and fight in the Six-Day War. He was a reservist. And Shultz couldn't understand why he wouldn't stay an extra week, and he said, no, I have to go. And he went and he was killed. And later on, Shultz visited his family in Israel, and through that particular personal identification, he came to understand something about Israel that he always admired very much. So he was instinctively anxious to work closely with Begin and his colleagues, but he came into office in the middle of the Lebanon War at the worst possible moment. And so his first 6 or 8 months were the experience of wrestling with things like Sabra and Shatila and a depressed Begin who was fading from the scene, and Arik Sharon who was fighting for his life, and it didn't get him off to the best start in his dealings with Israel. But by the time he came out and finished the negotiation of the Lebanon Agreement and worked very closely with the Israeli negotiators and government in the spring of '83, that experience solidified his relationship with Israel's leaders, particularly with Shamir and with Ahrens and with some others. So he had a very correct and more than correct and useful working relationship with the Israelis for the rest of the time he was Secretary of State. And he worked hard at trying to get the peace process back on the road, but a lot of other issues in the region ultimately frustrated him, and I don't think it was, and also Reagan personally never engaged in the issue very much, so that it was really left to Shultz. And if we were to get back into the game seriously at that point, I think you would have had to have something of the presidential engagement that Carter had provided. Carter kind of spoiled everybody in a way by spending so much time on Arab-Israeli affairs. So ever after, and this is a problem today and will be for the next administration, unless our president will spend time on Arab-Israeli affairs, they don't totally take seriously the American involvement. I mean, they may respect the Secretary of State, as they do certainly respect Jim Baker very much. And Baker has spoken enough as Bush's surrogate, so he's managed to get over this. And Bush has been engaged to some degree. But if Governor Clinton is elected, for example, and concentrates just on just on domestic affairs, and doesn't establish some involvement personally in Arab-Israeli matters, it's going to be hard for his Secretary of State to be taken seriously enough in this negotiating game. That's a long diversion. I want to come back, if I can, for one thing on Sharon. That is Sharon and me. When I first got there as ambassador, Sharon decided it was important that he convince me. So for about 2 or 3 years, he did everything he could to persuade me that the settlements drive in the West Bank was really good, not an obstacle to peace, but was a good thing. He would invite me to go up for tours of the West Bank and brief me on the topography and take me around to these new villages and put me together with the wonderful pioneer stock that was settling them. And he and Lily, his wife, both courted me and my wife, invited us to come down to his farm and laid out the war stories. And he can be very charming, and he's taken a lot of people into camp over the years. And certainly I had no reason not to deal with him and to learn as much about him as possible. So we were friendly in a formal sense, though I was never persuaded. And little by little he came to realize that he wasn't succeeding and that I wasn't convinced that he was the Archangel Gabriel, or that his approach toward the Palestinian problem was the right one. And as time went on, he began to identify me as part of the enemy. So and during 1981, after he became defense minister, the U.S.-Israeli relationship after September began to go steadily downhill. And we had indeed, as you recall, reacted very violently when Begin decided to annex the Golan Heights over a weekend and did it on Monday without so much as a fare thee well. And we suspended our first strategic cooperation agreement, and that led to a huge emotional outburst of Begin against me and against Reagan, and a famous speech which he delivered to me in his bedroom, 55 minutes long, without a note about how the U.S. was treating Israel like a banana republic and a teenager, and did we think by slapping them on the wrist they would come into line and they'd rather eat margarine than give way to American pressure. And it was a fascinating vignette of Begin at his most histrionic. By the end of the year, our relationship was really very, very strained, end of '81. And they were warming up for the Lebanon War, and we knew it was coming. I was back in Washington on consultation and talked over a lot about my worries about the situation. When I went back to Israel, I had a private meeting with Simcha Ehrlich, who was the Minister of Finance, the leader of the liberal faction, the moderate liberal faction in the Likud, and an old, shrewd old politician who also really detested Arik Sharon. I went to see him to talk frankly with him about my worries about where the U.S.-Israel relationship was going, having just been aware from being in Washington how the reactions here had been to these set of events in the late fall, and my worries about an impending Lebanon dust-up coming. I wanted to get his advice as to what we might do to try to get the relationship smoothed back into a more cooperative mode. He unburdened himself about Arik Sharon, and we exchanged a few mutual assessments of Arik's very negative role in the U.S.-Israeli relationship. Arik was going out of his way by this point to stick his thumb in our eye, publicly and privately, on every opportunity. A year later, and he then talked to Begin, and Begin talked to me. Al Haig came out on a trip. Things got temporarily smoothed over a bit. Arik was a little quieter, but it didn't last long. About a year later, at the end of, no, I take it back. It was 2 years later, the end of '80. I've got the chronology mixed up. Either 1 or 2 years later, in any event. I was on home leave in the United States during December, and I got a telephone call from a journalist friend, Israeli journalist friend, said that Sharon had just given an interview in which he had accused me of treason. I thought that was a little strange, but because allegedly I had plotted with Simcha Ehrlich to have him fired from the from the cabinet. This was the kind of behavior which no self-respecting country could accept, and therefore he was demanding that I be declared persona non grata and thrown out of the country, and he was making that formal demand to the Prime Minister. This was the press story. And the press story, which was put out by a journalist confidant of Sharon's, also claimed that he had written documentation of this meeting, which proved my guilt in plotting his dismissal. Well, I was in Washington, and this was all going on in Israel. None of this ever appeared in the Washington press. It wasn't of any interest back here, but it was all over the Israeli press. And after a number of consultations of one kind or another, I just basically laid low. I didn't respond to the comments for a while, and I got in touch with the by then Prime Minister Shamir, who was having his own troubles with Sharon, and told him that I didn't know what I should do about this. I thought it was improper. Denied having plotted getting anybody fired. And said I'd had a conversation with Simcha Ehrlich. By this time, Simcha Ehrlich is dead, which further complicates the problem. He died in the interim, and many people took this as a very cheap shot by Sharon directed at Ehrlich after he died, as much as at me. I got word back from Shamir that he would prefer I say nothing about it. He would take care of it. Sharon persisted. He then wrote a formal letter and released it to the press, to the Prime Minister, demanding my removal. Then I got a message from Shamir, well, perhaps you better say something. So then I got a journalist friend of mine in Israel, and still I'm back in Washington. I gave an interview over the phone to this journalist, which she then put on television, and repeated on television there, explaining the circumstances of the meeting and denying the allegations. And then there was a lot of interesting press treatment of this issue. And a number of the journalists wrote about it in this vein. If we have to decide whether to believe the credibility of Sam Lewis or Ariel Sharon, there's not much question who we believe more. So it ultimately died away, but I was terribly angry about this. Not only the internecine warfare which carried on, but the fact that he'd pulled this stunt while I was away. So when I went back to Israel, we went back to Israel. We have an annual 4th of July reception there, which is a big event, and all the cabinet are invited, and most of them come, typically to the American ambassadors. The next 4th of July, I decided I'm no longer going to invite Arik Sharon to my house. If I have to deal with him professionally, I will. I will be perfectly proper, but I see no reason to extend any more hospitality to this fellow after what he's tried to pull. So we didn't invite him, and we didn't send him an invitation to the 4th of July party. He then went around Israel for months thereafter, complaining about being boycotted by the American ambassador. And that is a pretty good vignette about the sort of internecine warfare and or collaboration that goes on between American ambassadors and Israeli politicians. It's a very free-swinging society, but Arik is the freest swinger of the whole crowd, and also the most unreliable. He's really a liar. He's able and charming and tough and nasty. He has a huge ego. He's basically a dangerous politician, and I don't think he'll ever be Prime Minister.
Speaking of internecine warfare, you got into the ambassadorship of Israel by political fallout with the transition, but you stayed on, surviving several transitions from one Secretary of State to another, different changes in the NSC, and 2 administrations. How easy was it to handle that transition? Do you have anything things to offer about the process of transition. Do we handle this well in the Middle East as opposed to other regions?
So far, I think we've handled it pretty well in the Middle East as opposed to other regions. The big transition was the one from Carter to Reagan, where you change parties. I assumed that after 3.5 years in Israel, I would be replaced, though I was a career officer. I'd been there a long time. I really didn't want to leave, however. I was enjoying the job, and I was sounded out about a couple of Washington jobs in the State Department. I just told people I'd really much prefer to stay here because we're in the middle of this autonomy negotiation. I'd like to see the peace process completed before I leave, but I had really no expectation I would stay. What happened was Al Haig decided that we had a good professional team in all the Middle East embassies, and he would prefer to keep the career people in place, partly, I think, so as not to have any argument about sending another ambassador to Israel, somebody who would, you'd have the question of the political candidates. And one reason Wally Barber stayed there for 11 years through Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon was that whenever the job came up to be changed, somebody concluded it was simpler to keep him there since he was doing okay or well, rather than confront the choice issue for a post that had some political complications attached to it. I think some of that affected me, but I think it was more that Haig made, I think, a wise decision to keep everybody in place, at least for a while. And then I got to know Haig pretty well. He was out there several times. We seemed to hit it off. He had confidence in me. And then after Shultz came in, initially Shultz was, I think, very skeptical of me. In fact, because he came in the middle of the Lebanon War, and I was trying to explain to him back here in Washington, I was back for a lot of that time, trying to explain to Shultz why Begin is behaving the way he is and why Sharon, what Sharon is like. Inevitably, an ambassador who explains why other government leaders are doing something, psychologically you get kind of tarred with representing them, which I certainly wasn't. But after Shultz had been in office about 2 or 3 months, one night he turned to me and he said, "You know, I just got around to reading the Camp David agreements." He said, "You know, you guys did a hell of a job. That was really an extraordinary accomplishment." And he had come by that point to understand a bit more about what was making the Israelis so angst-ridden. And we became close associates, and I guess convinced Shultz that I was doing an objective job. And then ultimately, I was going to retire anyway when I left Israel, and I made that clear to people. So in 1984, I was planning to retire at the end of 1984. Peres was elected, finally, after all these efforts, became prime minister in September of '84. And Shimon and I were very close friends, and are. And he begged me to stay on. He said, "Look, you can be a tremendous help to me and to the relationship. Don't retire now, stick around for a while." And I said, no, I've really had it. I mean, this is now 7 years, and even to work with you, which I'd like to do, is appealing, but not quite appealing enough. We went to Washington about that time, Peres making his first official trip as prime minister. And we met with Shultz and President Reagan and everybody. And just before the visit was over, Shultz and Peres and I had lunch, just the three of us, supposedly to talk about the visit. And we did talk about the visit and what next steps were to be. But in the course of this lunch, the two of them both urged me to remain. And they apparently had talked about it beforehand. So I couldn't really argue, so I agreed to stay another year, and I did stay until the summer of '85. I didn't want to leave if there was peace in the offing, but by that time it was pretty clear it was still some distance in the future. Now, I think transitions are tricky. It works better in some parts of the world than others because the Middle East has been essentially a bipartisan U.S. policy toward the Arab-Israeli conflict. Despite the atmospherics, the policy line is quite consistent back for 20 years now. And I think there's a good chance that if there's a transition coming up, it can be managed in a way that will be relatively bipartisan, though inevitably personalities at the top are going to affect it. It's not so smooth in other parts of the world, and it's least smooth in Washington. It really is. We've got a very messy system, and to get the people appointed and in place, the assistant secretaries run the government, basically, and it takes so long to get them confirmed, get them selected, to get them cleared, to get them confirmed, that you can have 6 months or a year of spinning of wheels and business as usual, but no innovation. And in the Middle East, that's very dangerous, to have a real hiatus. There are just too many time bombs laying around, and I think administrations have rather consistently understood that and been not anxious to have big upheavals right away among the Middle East personnel.
Can I get you to change focus a little bit and talk about the role of military considerations in our diplomatic relationship with Israel? Specifically, a couple of questions. To what do you attribute Israel's military success, first of all? And then secondly, what has been the role of arms sales in the Middle East in our diplomatic relationship with Israel?
Well, on the first point, I think it really goes back to the early years of the Israeli armed forces, which, of course, it grew out of the Palmach and the Haganah of the pre-state period. And when those forces were reorganized into a real army, a modern army in the late 40s or early 50s, some of the leaders of the pre-state army became the leaders of the new army, particularly Dayan and Yigal Allon and some others. And the doctrines that evolved were very much derivative, I think, of the doctrines of paramilitary forces. And Ord Wingate's influence on the pre-state forces comes down into modern history, really, through the IDF doctrines. Maneuver, quick reaction, offensive tactics versus defense, unconventional warfare, and so forth. Tremendous also influence of the egalitarian nature of Israeli society, which has made the Israeli army a much more egalitarian kind of army. There is plenty of discipline, and there's more today than there used to be. But there is still a tremendous emphasis on individual initiative. In that respect, it's much more like the American Army than any other army. And that's why I think our military, professional military people, when they work with Israeli military, usually find it very satisfying, because there is a kind of similarity in doctrine. Now, we're much bigger and more formal and more concerned about how the uniforms look, and that kind of gets in the way at times. There also is this tradition of not having to make do. The Israeli military's had to scratch it out hard from the beginning with makeshift weapons and small forces and clandestinely acquired arms and so forth. So they've developed a tradition of developing an awful lot of equipment domestically to make up for the fact that people haven't been ready to sell them arms. So they've had to develop a domestic arms industry, and an increasingly sophisticated one. They have become quite ingenious at modifying other people's weapons and improving them because they've had so much battle experience. And if you fight wars every 6 or 7 years, your army, first place, keeps well trained and takes training seriously. And secondly, there's a very easy way of putting back into the equipment development cycle the battlefield experience. And in a small country, of course, it's easier anyway. Sure. So their lead time on developing weapons and their flexibility in adapting them, I think, is a reflection really of their situation and the fact that they've been at war ever since they were created. They've never been at total peace, ever. Finally, I think their doctrine of fighting the war on the other guy's territory stems right straight from the country, the size of the country. It's too small a country to allow an enemy to get very far into the country and to your major centers, so that their doctrine from early days has been, if war is inevitable, you take it to him and you fight it on his territory to protect our own cities.
Two other issues are often raised when you talk about this military effectiveness of the Israelis. One is that their enemies have been so inept. Yeah. And secondly, to the extent that they have been getting weapons from the outside, they're largely U.S. weapons, which are superior to the basically Soviet-provided weapons of the Arabs.
Well, that's the second point is only recently true. After all, the biggest victory they ever fought was the victory of the Six-Day War, in which that was fought with French weapons. Didn't have any American weapons except some planes. Their earlier victories were all fought with scruffy stuff acquired from the international arms market. It is true that their superiority today, I think, is strongly reinforced by the American weapons pipelines, which have been open to them for the last decade or more, pretty much open. As far as the ineptness of the Arabs are concerned, that certainly was a factor, big factor in the '48 war. The disorganization, the corruption of the Arab armies, the lack of initiative on the part of the generals, and so forth. And the '56 war, I think, as well, the Sinai campaign. By the time you get to '67, surprise certainly was a big factor. That is doctrine, tactics, and perhaps also the difficulty of coalitions fighting against an interior single nation was a factor. But the Israelis have a very healthy respect for Arab fighting qualities of the ground forces, particularly the Syrians and the Jordanians, less so the Egyptians. And as a much more advanced society in terms of education and technical skills, the Israelis have been much more able to utilize modern weapons effectively. The Arabs are catching up, however, and steadily catching up. In the Syrian army, in the Lebanon war, the Syrian ground forces, tank forces, performed very well and really gave the Israelis a very tough time. The Air Force still has been the premier arm for Israel and remains highly superior. But you can see the curve is narrowing, and the Israelis understand that, and that's one of the reasons certainly why they see this next 5 years or so as a very important window to try to achieve peace finally. Because wars in the future will not be as easy. There will be much more likelihood of great damage to the domestic economy and the cities and the homes and the rest. And Israel does have this huge preoccupation with loss of life. As a small country with a Holocaust tradition, even one Israeli soldier is mourned extraordinarily by the society. And the Arabs know at this point that they're vulnerable to casualties. And so future wars, if there are any, God forbid, terror tactics against the home fronts, I think, are going to be clearly utilized, as Saddam Hussein attempted to do it in the Gulf War.
Your answer already suggests the answer to the second half of my question, which was about the role that arms in the Middle East, or U.S. arms deals with the Middle East, are playing in diplomacy with Israel now.
They've always been a very important part of the diplomatic equation. The whole question of how you build parallel strategic relationships with some key Arab countries and with Israel has often come back to the question of arms sales. We have wanted certain base rights in the Arab world. To get them, we've had to sell arms. By selling arms, we have increased the Israelis' perception, at least, of their security problems. They have insisted they had to get more arms from us, and that sets up a further demand among the Arabs. And we've assured the Israelis now for decades that we would not permit their qualitative edge militarily to be lost, and we would sell whatever was necessary or provide whatever was necessary to do that. But our desire to sell weapons generally and export products of our industry in the Arab world has run up against that commitment, and increasingly does, especially in the aircraft field. And it's an unending cycle, and weapons are getting more and more expensive. And as Israel, as the smaller and poorer part of the equation, is priced out of the market, the Israelis themselves understand more and more that turning down the arms race is the only hope they have in the long run for satisfactory maintenance of a superior security position.
Right.
And they were very pleased, I think, last year with the initial Middle East arms proposal that the President put out. Unfortunately, implementing policies generally doesn't follow a smooth course. And
Sure.
we've rather abandoned the policy in favor of jobs in St. Louis recently.
Right. Could you also address one last issue along that same line, is their nuclear capability and the extent to which they were willing to discuss that with you candidly? I mean, what position did they take with you on that?
It was a non-subject.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't press to talk about it. They certainly wouldn't. It really is a very interesting subject in the history of the relationship. Cy Hirsch's recent book on this subject is full of inaccuracies, but it also is full of a lot of interesting insights. And it's been discredited deliberately, I think, by the Israelis because of and it can be discredited because of a number of inaccuracies. But the general line of analysis of the way this issue has been treated between our governments since the early 50s is quite correct. But it was never a topic in 8 years. Now, with some journalists on the fringes of the national security establishment and some few scholars beginning to write about it, you get into some guarded discussions occasionally, but not with officials. Mm-hmm. Never with any Israeli official of any kind, mm-hmm. or a politician for that matter. Can I come back for a minute to a question you raised earlier, quickly, Peres and Rabin? I got to know both of them very well. Peres I thought was going to be the one I dealt with as prime minister. So I had studied him, and I became very friendly with him when he was leader of the opposition for so long. And I like him personally a lot, and his wife. Rabin was a bitter, and we became reasonably good friends, however. We ended up playing tennis together about every Saturday for a long time at the tennis club. And we know his wife and he quite well. They are two halves of a statesman, if I can put it that way. Working together, they complement each other beautifully. Peres has imagination and creativity and eloquence and diplomatic skill and vision. He has 10 ideas, of which one is probably good. He is much more personable. He is a politician's politician in a sense, in that he's willing to do the dirty work of looking after the party and cultivating the party workers and doing the tough jobs when they're in opposition and keeping the party together for years while everybody else was despairing about it after Begin's victory. Unfortunately, he acquired over the years this image of slipperiness, tricky Dick, or to use a more contemporary characterization, slick Shimon. And that has haunted him. He's been, I believe, one of the cleanest personally politicians in Israel. I don't think there's ever been any serious allegation of corruption against either one of them, for that matter, except Rabin's trivial but quite crucial mistake about keeping a bank account here in Washington, which cost him his prime ministership. But Peres doesn't convey to the Israeli public that sense of solid strength and purpose and toughness that Rabin does. Rabin is square, no sense of humor, no vision, no small talk, doer, hardworking, smart, enormously analytical. He's acquired, I think, a well-deserved reputation for the best analyst of Israel's problems, military security problems at least, of anybody in the country. And he can give you by far the best analysis in very cold, unemotional terms without any vision, dreams added on. He had, however, as chief of staff and as prime minister the first time around, a reputation as not a very decisive decision maker. Great staff officer. Question about his ultimate executive skills. Now, in this current incarnation as prime minister, so far he seems to be more decisive, but he's been displaying the same problem he displayed as prime minister before, of having almost no confidants around him, a weak staff in the prime ministry, and keeping all decisions very much to himself, and not using a staff very effectively, which may catch up with him. If you can have the two men working together, they work as an excellent team because they do have these contrasting strengths and weaknesses. But they've been bitter rivals now for 15, 20 years. Rabin in particular despises Peres and thinks that he has undermined him many times deliberately, that his ego is impossible to deal with, that he will push to the head of any issue and take credit for whatever happens, that he will... Anyway, Rabin can go on by the hour about Peres and does, usually with a few scotches. Peres is more gentlemanly about Rabin, but he also really detests him. I don't think detests, I think he respects him, doesn't like him, and knows that Rabin detests him, so that, and they've been rivals for party leadership. First one would win, then the other. And now the wheel has turned again, probably the final turn, though who knows. They've been the Bobsey twins of labor politics for the last 20 years, and the generation that they were part of is all passed on except them, but they're still there. And the next echelon and the next echelons of labor leaders are pygmies by comparison, though each man are only partial as national leaders. They're still both extraordinarily able. And Rabin is much more able than Peres to convey to the country as a whole, not just to the Labor Party constituency, confidence in his leadership. Rabin's appeal reaches into the Likud ranks because he's basically a security person. He's concerned about, his life has been dedicated to the security of the country. Peres has too in a certain sense, but he never served in the army. He was a civilian military defense official. He was the father of Israel's nuclear industry, by the way, as well as much of its high technology when he was Director General of the Defense Ministry back in the 50s. He was Ben-Gurion's fair-haired boy, much more than Rabin. And Peres has been the object of much jealousy for years because he and Diane were the chosen young acolytes for Ben-Gurion, and they've been very successful and very able and also flawed, and the subjects of enormous jealousy by a lot of others throughout their careers. And part of that is in the background of the Rabin Perez duo. It's kind of like a dance of death. I mean, they're really bound together, and I don't think one will ever leave politics before the other.
Can I pick up on discussion we had earlier about the relationship between academics and policymakers? And in the last 10 minutes that we have left, ask you to speculate a little bit on the lessons of history. We've talked a little bit about perhaps the desirability of keeping the same players involved on a bureaucratic level of presidential involvement, but in the next administration, which at least now perhaps one might assume that we will have soon, there's a question of what kind of vision for the future that the new administration ought to have with respect to the Arab-Israeli issue in particular. And you've been working on this issue now for 15 years. And if you were called in to have a 15-minute conversation or more and to give some sense of what it was that one needed to think about and how one had to approach it, what would those 15 years have given you reason to tell the new president?
First, the region is riper for peace than it's ever been. The key players in the Arab-Israeli conflict are tired of war and are ready for peace. Second, there is such an overlay of history and so much history to be overcome, so many scars, so many wounds. They can't make it without a major external role by the United States. And I say the United States because I really don't think any of the other national players or the UN can play the role that the U.S. can play in this particular problem of mediation. That's not necessarily true for all conflicts, but the history of this one and our involvement with Israel is such that nobody else can play the role unless we take the lead in playing it. Third, Carter and to some degree his predecessors have spoiled the players, so the president has to be a player, though he can't necessarily be the kind of player Carter was and wouldn't have to be. But you're going to have a Secretary of State and a key group of officials with him, or a special representative that you clearly have confidence in and who works closely with the Secretary of State, to spend full time or nearly full time on prodding this process forward that's been erected very skillfully by Baker and Bush, taking advantage of the fact that the situation is ripe for real negotiations, much more broadly than was true 10 years ago. It's not going to come quickly. It's a matter of 2, 3, 4 years, and then you'll probably have partial success. But I think that there is a very good chance that this decade of the 90s, we will see a peaceful accommodation between Israel and its immediate neighbors, not necessarily Iran or Iraq, but the immediate neighborhood, if in some full peace treaty arrangements and perhaps some partial ones. To get there, there's got to be a lot of staying power in the American role as catalyst and honest broker and prodder and tempter with carrots and occasionally lever with some implied sticks on all parties. Our role is very complicated and subtle and has to be played with a lot of sensitivity to the sensitivities of the parties. To play it, because of the history of the U.S.-Israeli relationship and that ultimately Israel is the one that has to give up things to get peace and run risks in the security area, we've got to maintain a close personal rapport between our President, Secretary of State, and the Israeli Prime Minister in particular, and others there. And we've got to maintain a good working relationship at the military, at the professional military level. And we've got to be prepared to sustain a certain level of economic support for Israel until you get to peace, because the weapons problem isn't going to go away until you're pretty far down the road in a peace that's been digested by the players. We're in a multilateral negotiating situation now in a much more real sense than we were in the Carter years. The Europeans are now important players, so is the UN to a certain degree, and the Russians. But their importance really lies in the region-wide issues and working on the regional issues like arms control and water and economic development. And I think the bilateral mediation of the borders and the peace treaties is a role the U.S. has got to continue to carry. And I'm not at all sure that the next administration will have the energy or the interest to do this. I mean, assuming that if there is a new administration, its focus is going to be largely domestic. And there will be other international crises which will demand attention. But I think we've got a real chance, and it would be a tragedy if we don't persist, pick up this process that has really made remarkable strides historically in the last year and help carry it to fruition. That's the advice I would give. In fact, it's the advice I have given, so I can repeat it.
Well, I suppose unless there's one more short question, we have about 3 or 4 minutes.
You know, as a matter of fact, what's the worst gaffe you ever made as ambassador to Israel?
Gosh, I don't know. There were so many. I don't think I can remember the worst.
Well, as a matter of fact, you pictured yourself as, when you first arrived, realized that you were walking on eggshells. You must have walked on them for 8 years.
I don't know about the worst gaffe. One of the most amusing kinds of events, which was in a sense a gaffe, I realized after I'd been in Israel about a week that this was a 24-hour-a-day job, that the American ambassador, particularly at a period of high-profile involvement, peace process and the rest, was a kind of national celebrity, and the press was after you at every moment, and everything you did was scrutinized, and any party you went to was a political debate, and there really was no way to escape from 24-hour political and diplomatic life. And that I would go nuts if I didn't find something else to get away from, some way to get away from it. I'd been a scuba diver for years, and I'd been a snorkeler for years, and I always wanted to be a scuba diver. So I happened to run into a friend who was a diving instructor, and I took diving lessons. And for the next 8 years, whenever possible, several times a year, I would escape down to the Sinai coast, first when it was under Israeli control, and then later when the Egyptians had it, and spend several days diving. And getting underwater, where you can't hear anything but your own bubbles, is the best therapy in the world from politics. Well, I was down at Sharm el-Sheikh in 1978, I think, sometime during '78. And I'd been diving in the afternoon, got off the boat, was walking back into the diving center, carrying my tanks, and all hot and sandy. And the girl running the diving center came running out. Sam, Sam, the Prime Minister's on the phone. So I went into the office and picked up the phone. He said, Sam, where are you? I said, well, I've been underwater, Mr. Prime Minister. I'm getting a little vacation. He says, I need you immediately. Well, I'm a long way away. What's the problem? I can't tell you over the phone. Get back as soon as you can. So I called the embassy and found out it was a trivial matter, which he didn't need me at all for. So I asked my loyal deputy to get a hold of him right away and explain that there was no way that I could get back unless they sent a plane or a helicopter down for me within a day, and try to take care of it. Well, he did take care of it, and they didn't send a helicopter. And the next time I saw Begin, he looked at me like this. He says, I don't think you were really underwater at all.
Well, on that note, we've gone from the air to the water. And,
Here we are on the ground.
on behalf of the Living History Program, thank you very much.
My pleasure.